Governor Ned Lamont presented his two-year, $55.2 billion spending recommendations to Connecticut lawmakers on Wednesday, February 5th, kicking off the legislative budget process for this session. The Municipal Voice was on location at the Capitol to talk to lawmakers about the budget. We are joined this week by CCM Policy Director Brian O'Connor and Associate Director Randy Collins, who will respond to Governor Lamont's budget address. The Municipal Voice is the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities podcast in collaboration with WNHH LP 103.5 FM. I'm your host, Matt Ford. As always, be sure to give us a like and let us know what you're thinking in the comments. CCM's Municipal Voice podcast continues to present a key forum on important state-local issues. The views expressed do not necessarily reflect the consensus views of CCM or member municipal leaders.
Austin, Senator, thanks for joining us.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing good. So we came here today to talk about budget, or a
I heard there's a document coming out today.
There's a document coming out today from the governor
Yep.
that we're interested in. I think you are too. And I know one thing that we were talking about before we got started, Brian, we're talking about special education funding. There was a proposal, I think, $40 million. I wonder if we could talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So right now, the state puts in, we put in from the legislative budget last year, $181 million into special education. We knew then that it was going to be a shortfall, about $80 million shortfall. It's actually crept up to be about $101 million of a shortfall in the current year that we're in. The governor's budget puts $40 million in the second year of the biennium. So we will have no new money if we went with the governor's proposal, because it is just a proposal. It's an idea.
Yeah.
And the legislature is actually has the responsibility of set state budget. So without putting any money in next year will be $126 million, which will directly impact municipalities and boards of education on the work that they need to do for special education.
Because that money needs to come from somewhere. If it isn't coming from the state, it doesn't come from the towns.
It has to come from the towns then. And right now it would be about $126 million in the first year of the biennium.
Wow. Brian, what's CCM's position on all this?
You know, one of the things that we're looking at, we just had a public press conference with our 5 biggest city mayors. We're looking to increase special education by raising the foundation, putting special education within the formula. It's not currently there. So that would be an additional weight. And we'd also look at increasing the weights for multilingual language learners. And that would be, it's a big number. It's $545 million. But also I think it's aspirational in a certain sense, where I think that's where we need to do, and also to modernize the ECS formula.
So I'm not opposed to modernizing the ECS formula, and we already have a weight-in for English language learners, often referred to as ELL.
Yep.
That's already a part of the formula, and a good portion of the ECS money is spent on special education with no weight added to it, but it is spent on special education services. About a third of every budget spends their ECS money. A third of the ECS money is spent on special education per town. So we're already doing it. I'm not certain that I'm in favor of $500 million. It has to come from someplace, and when people tell me that they would like me to spend $500 million, give or take, I'm going to tell everybody the same thing. That is going to cause a tax increase. In some way or another, we have to get the money from someplace. And so that's just my feeling on it, because we don't have $500 million to cut out of any one line item in the budget.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that we've actually been stating, is that it hasn't kept up with inflation. So it's been a property tax increase, as far as the level of funding from 2013. So at the very least, looking at the foundation, which hasn't been increased since then, just to kind of keep up with, the rising costs of, educating our children.
And the proposal that you have in front of you talks about just traditional schools. It does not talk about the choice schools like VOAG, VOTEC, charters, magnets, any of those school systems. So it would actually be significantly higher than 500 million if we were going to treat all schools the same. And that's always been a goal, is to treat all schools the same. And we very much need our VOAG and VOTEC schools. Those are job creator schools. People get jobs right out of those high school environments, and we really need those. So those are things that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about such a large number.
Thank you.
Another budget thing that we wanted to talk about today was funding to support mass transit such as rail, bus service, and highway. Brian, what are we looking for there?
You know, there is, we're looking at an increase in funding so we can look at microtransit busing, which has been effective in many of our communities, but also looking at the rail line, Shoreline East, between Old Saybrook and New London, and then from New London up to Norwich.
Oh, I'm a huge fan of extending Shoreline East. Right now, it annualized the $5 million that we put in ARPA dollars last year, is my understanding. Shoreline East needs the same kind of attention that the other sections of rail have received around the state, whether it's the Hartford line, the New Haven line, Danbury. All of those assets received significant influx of both federal dollars and state dollars, and built up the usage of those lines, in particular after COVID. And often what is used as an excuse that it's very expensive to run Shoreline East, and it is expensive, but we offset public transportation across the board in this state, whether it's paving roads for automobiles, or it's bus lines, or it's the western side of the state's rail system. So we should pay just as much attention to the eastern side of the state on Shoreline East. My goal would eventually see Shoreline East have a spur that goes up towards the Norwich area and heads right up into Rhode Island. It's what we should be looking at, and it's how we should be addressing the issues.
Like, cool. I would actually like that train. I would take that down to the shore.
One of the other things that I think we were looking at, we were actually recently released a pretty significant study on flooding and infrastructure maintenance. Came right on the heels of the August 18th storm in Oxford. And we look at that and say, if that had hit in eastern Connecticut, what would that have done to like the Fitchville Dam in Bosra? And I guess since it's budget day, we'll keep asking about different funding. But do we see any additional support for infrastructure improvement and resiliency projects? I know the governors and the Commissioner Dykes have made some indication of helping municipalities with technical assistance and meeting some of the federal match requirements. Have we heard anything on how to do that?
So first of all, I think we should be cognizant of the fact that there's a significant shakeup happening right now in the federal budget, and I'm not certain that we can count on matches on the federal side in many of the different areas, and climate resiliency would be one of those. And I well remember the storms in Oxford, but I also remember the storms that happened the year before in the town of Scotland, which is about 2 miles from my house, where they lost 3 bridges with people stuck on the other side of the bridge. And it took a lot of time for people to pay attention to that. Now, that same storm caused a washout in one of our freight rail lines, and did a number of other things that were significantly damaged but did not receive the press that Oxford did. And I understand why. It's more densely populated on the other side of the state, and it impacted more people. But the damage was still significant. And on the freight rail line, we had to get that fixed because we have the largest egg producer in eastern Connecticut. That's the largest egg producer east of the Mississippi is in eastern Connecticut.
Wow.
And they need to feed their birds. And in order to feed their birds, they need that rail line to bring in the feed that they have to mix. And that was not going to happen if we didn't fix it right away. So we were able to get it fixed right away, but the reality was that was not going to happen was very important, not just in Eastern Connecticut, but broadly on the whole eastern side of the United States, being as they are so large. So I'm very much in favor of us putting more money in for resiliency. I put a bill in last year to deal with $20 million of set aside to use should we have just such a situation like Oxford, like what happened in the town of Scotland and a number of other places. And I think that it's something that we need to be prepared for. The storms that we are having are different than the storms used to be. We have significant flooding that's happening. Now, we had a number of forest fires last year that had a potential to be dangerous. And the Fitchville Dam is an old dam. It's a really old dam, but our problem on the Yanick River is more than just the Fitchville Dam. We have very narrow channels that have been developed over time, and there is no place for the water to go. So we need to build in some watershed areas for some of these rivers who have been constrained by infrastructure building up and not understanding what was going to happen.
As we've talked about a lot of different things that I think obviously all cost a lot of money, and I know you and I have spoken, and you said, I think at the time, you had $3 billion in new requests.
Yes.
And we are constrained
More than
by
that now.
every day, I'm sure. It keeps going. How are we looking? I know we have the fiscal guardrails, which have given us a lot of stability, but have also constrained the ability to fund some of these things. I know the governor said that there might be some workarounds. Are you hearing, or are there ways to work or modify the fiscal guardrails to more meet some of the needs that we have?
I think there's ways to work, in particular with the volatility cap, and the governor has indicated by his budget that he is willing to work around the volatility cap. His budget does make limited changes to the volatility cap that recognizes that we have a problem. So we need to all sit down. I tell everybody, you and I have had this conversation, the governor's budget is merely a proposal. It does not mean that we're going to follow all of the governor's ideas. Some of them are good ideas. Some of them don't meet the need. Like we talked about for special education. That doesn't meet the need. We need to address the need. That's something that has to happen. That's true across the board. The governor's also indicated that he's willing to work outside the confines of the budget by having an off-budget account to provide some resources for daycare and pre-K, but it doesn't provide any money for 2 years. And not only does it not provide any money for 2 years, it sets up another account where we can have money in a bank, and we would only be allowed to address maybe 10% of that to help out with daycare. And again, Eastern Connecticut has long been known as a childcare desert. It's the only part of the state that one of our major employers is putting money into childcare. In no other part of the state does that happen, where we have a business that's paying a third of the expenses of childcare. But we're willing to do that in Eastern Connecticut. It shows how serious we are, but it also shows how we have to take on the extra burden in Eastern Connecticut for these costs.
Very good. Well, thank you, Senator, for your time today. I know you got a busy day ahead.
Yes,
of you.
absolutely. Thank you, Senator Kathy Austin, for coming on the Municipal Voice.
Thanks. Thank
Good to
you.
have you as always.
Appreciate it.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
And now we have Comptroller Sean Scanlon with us. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Happy Budget Day.
Happy Budget Day to you. So thanks for coming. A lot of things to talk about. Brian, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, thank you again, Comptroller Scanlon, for coming in. I think one of the things, obviously, it's Budget Day. How do our revenues look, throughout the rest of the year? Are we going to have a deficit? Are we going to have a surplus?
Yeah, so on the first of every month, my office projects what the fiscal position of the budget is going to be at the end of the fiscal year. And a few days ago, on February 1st, we projected that we have a $433 million surplus. That was a big increase of what we predicted in January because of this COVID assistance interest. That was the decision was made by the governor to put that into the general fund, and therefore that saw a big jump. So we're at 433, but that's a similar story to what we've seen in the last couple of years, where we've had 7 consecutive years of ending with a fiscal surplus at the end of the year. And we continue to see us making great strides to this effect that I think we're in the strongest fiscal position we've been in many, many decades.
That's great. People always remember some of the issues that we had in the mid, 2015, 2016 era. How has, the guardrails worked in that situation, providing stability, but also are people looking at the volatility cap and any remedies there to kind of release some of the constraints?
Well, look, 10 years ago, Connecticut was in the midst of a permanent fiscal crisis. And I think 10 years later, because of the guardrails and the discipline and our discipline to adhering to them, we have ended that permanent fiscal crisis and stabilized our finances. I think what you're going to hear the governor talking about today is how do we continue making progress on stabilizing those finances, but also address the next crisis, which is an affordability crisis facing the people of Connecticut, whether that's the cost of healthcare, childcare, energy, housing. All these things are hurting the residents of the state of Connecticut. And I think in the next 10 years, our focus needs to be continue our fiscal progress, but making Connecticut more affordable. And I think the governor's decision to roll out his budget today and make a slight tweak to the guardrails doesn't impact the integrity of them. We're still going to be doing what we have been doing, but we're also able to address the affordability crisis. And I think that's the balance that the people of Connecticut are looking for. Keep us going with what's working, but make my life more affordable. And I think we're going to do that starting today.
Great.
Randy, do you have any questions for the comptroller?
I think you hit on one of the key things when we talk about affordability. And from the municipal perspective, we look at the property tax. And when we hear about affordability of housing, one of the big things, the impediment to that in economic development is that over-reliance on the property tax and just the pressure that keeps getting pressed down onto it. Are we hearing anything or that we can start to look forward to of how we can alleviate some of that burden, where we can make progress on working together on that, which I think is critical to, as I said, housing, economic development, and everything in between.
Well, the governor's budget proposal adds $160 million more in ECS funding for municipalities across the state. He also adds, over the course of the biennium, $54 million of special education funding and ups the property tax credit from $300 to $350. That's the credit that the people of Connecticut get. So new municipal aid for ECS, new money for towns that are dealing with these crazy special education costs right now, I think is a start. I think many of your members would probably say, hey, we need more. And I think everyone recognizes that we need more. And the more we do as a state, the less the burden is going to be on the property taxpayer, which is the biggest tax that most individuals pay in the state every year. I think we just need to keep making progress as that being part of our affordability problem too, right? Which is that the towns only have one option pretty much to raise revenue and make sure that the police get what they need and the fire get what they need and the schools are going. And if we can help them with that burden through more funding as the governor proposed in his budget, I think that's a good thing for Connecticut.
Brian, we were talking about funding earlier with Senator Austin. What's CCM's position on some of this stuff?
Well, I think, obviously, I think the comptroller just hit it. It's education, it's housing, trying to figure out how to make Connecticut more affordable. And I think, one of the things that I think for our listeners and viewers is, right now special ed is one of our biggest cost drivers. What's one of the biggest cost drivers at the state level that you're seeing? Is it healthcare, employee costs?
Yeah, so, as the comptroller, most people don't realize this, but I run the largest employee-based health plan in the state. So 260,000 people get their insurance through my office. 60,000 of them are municipal workers, so cops, firefighters, public works professionals who are in something called the partnership plan. And I spent a lot of time on healthcare, and trying to drive down the cost of healthcare is something that's a big problem, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector. Hospitalization costs are up, drug costs are up, utilization, meaning people who use their insurance, all of that is increasing. And we're doing some things, and the governor talks about this today in his budget, of some proposals that will drive down healthcare costs, and he's asked me to take a lead on that, both in the plan that I run, but also trying to work on Medicaid, which is a big problem for our budget right now. We are seeing the same trends that are impacting the private market are impacting our Medicaid plan. So if it wasn't for the fact that we've turned around the budget, our budget may be in deficit right now because of the high cost of Medicaid. So again, I sound like a broken record, obviously, but we need to find those affordability drivers and attack them. And I think whether that's, again, energy, healthcare, childcare, all these things are things that I think you'll hear the governor talking about today. All these things are things that your mayors and first selectmen and town managers talk about every day. And to the extent that we can all work together on that, I think the Connecticut benefits.
Awesome.
I was going to say a couple other things. I know we have you tomorrow addressing our legislative committee.
Yeah.
Is there anything you'd like to say about CMERS, or you want to kind of wait until things flesh out a little?
Yeah,
bit?
keep everybody's suspense for 24 hours. But listen, it's no secret. I know your members know this. Since I took office in 2023, I've made reforming MERS a priority of my tenure. And, that's not going to, lead the nightly news, and it doesn't make sense on a bumper sticker on a car. But reforming MERS is something that was long overdue. In 2023, we stabilized the finances. When I took office, there was a 75% increase in the town's contribution rates over the last 5 years preceding. That's unsustainable. We got Democrats, Republicans, mayors, first selectmen, labor leaders around a table over 6 weeks in my office and negotiated the first reform of MERS in 30 plus years that will save the cities and towns in MERS, which are 107 of the 169, about $800 million over the course of the next 30 years.
Wow.
So if year one was about stabilizing the finances, year two was about giving municipalities ownership and control of the plan, something that they had never had before. The previous plan governance was run by the Retirement Commission. That's mostly focused on the state employee retirement plan.
Okay.
So the munis were essentially at the kids' table throughout this whole process. Now there's a new commission that took effect on January 1, equally represented for municipal officials and labor leaders, where they will control their own destiny of plan governance of that. And this year, 2025, I refer to it jokingly as the third movie in the trilogy, where we are going to create MERS 2.0 and a new benefit that, so from a certain date, let's just say it's July 1 of 2027, all new people hired by a MERS member will be in MERS 2.0. And then more importantly, any town that's not in MERS right now that is having a trouble with recruitment or retention for cops or firefighters, who's looking to maybe go back to a defined benefit plan after maybe going to a DC plan. This and the other reforms that we've done, I hope will entice them to come on in, test the water in the pool. It's fine. I think it's nice. And give it a shot, give us a look, and hopefully that will help towns in more than ways than one.
We are here with Senate Ranking Member Heather Summers. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me this morning.
Good to have you. So I understand that Connecticut Republicans came out with a proposed budget recently, and I wondered if we could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. What would you like to, you want to roll
wanna
down
know,
of it?
That'd
Okay, so the Connecticut Senate Republicans, we're listening to the citizens, right, and municipalities here in the state of Connecticut, and we thought it was important to put forward some ideas that are out of the box, they're different. I know that the Senate Dems accused us of stealing the governor's budget, which we think is funny. Maybe we had a preview, but we certainly didn't steal it. So great minds think alike sometimes. So, what we want to do is look at cutting the income tax across the board.
Okay.
Simplify the tax code, which is very complicated. Institute a 2% property cap for municipalities, and we can talk about that in more detail because I'm sure you're very interested in that. Cut licensing fees, reducing filing fees. That's something that we hear repeatedly, especially as the ranking member and former chair of public health. Why do we make nurses and physicians every year pay this fee to the state of Connecticut? It's not very consumer or business friendly. Tighten up the bonding cap, eliminate unfunded mandates. There's $10 million in tax credits that are standing out that we could look at to maybe repatriate some of those. Why are we giving these tax credits to certain entities? That hasn't been looked at. There's a group that is looking at that. And looking at that report when it comes back to find maybe the top 10 that work the most, and permanently extending our fiscal guardrails we think is very important. So those are some of the highlights of our plan. Some of the income tax, we would have $1,000 savings for the average family this year. And also, looking out in the future years, the majority of it would hit in 2028. So that's where we are.
How does this line up with CCM's proposals, Brian?
Well, I was just going to touch on it. You mentioned it, the guardrails, and trying to maintain the integrity of that. We've had a couple other speakers. We had Senator Austin and also Comptroller Scanlon here. They talked about the volatility cap, and maybe there's some room for some flexibility there. Has the caucus made a position, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's two differences of opinions. We can't forget that not too long ago, when Governor Malloy was here, we were in a dire situation. I'm sure you all remember. And the only reason that we are in the position that we are in today is because of these guardrails. The volatility cap, if you're going to lessen the constraints of volatility cap, the issue is you are then not paying down. The extra money in the volatility cap goes to the budget reserve. That is what's used to pay down the TERS and the SERS, which is the teacher's retirement, state employees' retirement, and of course our bonding debt, right? Yep. So if we're not doing that, then we are not paying down debt at probably about 8% interest, right? And we have done that. And I think we've spent over $10 billion paying down debt. And what that means for us is we have about $700 million more to spend in our budget.
Okay.
Because of that reduced payment. So you can look at it two ways. We want to continue those guardrails so that we can pay down our debt and have more money available to spend within our budget.
Great.
They want to go ahead and loosen the fiscal guardrails, which would require a 3/5 majority vote, which they have, right? To be able to usurp what we had really put in statute. We just voted to hold those guardrails last year.
Yep.
And now here we are looking at tweaking with them. And this just opens up the door for future legislatures to go in and tweak this and tweak that. And we're going to end up in the same path that we were for years before. And I keep saying the majority party had 38 years to do something about our debt service and where we were financially.
Yeah.
And they did nothing until we were 18 in the Senate. Now we're in a good trajectory. We have a good fund balance. We have a surplus. We're paying down debt, and now they want to change it. So that's what we're hesitant to do.
Excellent. Another thing we wanted to talk about was special education funding. We're wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you feel on that, whether it should be increased and how.
As a former mayor, special education is one of the biggest drivers of your budget, right? In the education budget, as the education overall. The Republicans, and myself in particular, I am a huge advocate of special education. I think the state should be fully funding education and fully funding special education. That's the biggest cost drivers that we have, especially on a local municipality.
Yep.
And that's why your property taxes are the way they are, because it's the largest portion of your budget. So if we're going to make meaningful reform, we really need to figure out how to fully fund it and how to fund it appropriately, especially some of our smaller towns. The formula that we have now for special education is you have to spend 4.5 times the cost of the average student. And for some smaller towns, their cost is higher. They can't amortize as much over as many people. So some of our small towns that I represent, the cost to educate might be $24,000. So they don't see one additional dime until a special education person gets to $125,000 in cost.
Yeah.
So you can imagine if you had 2 students at that range, that can throw a small town's budget completely out of whack, right? So I think that's a really important factor. And that gets back to the cap on the property tax that we had suggested. At first I was like, wow, I was the mayor, I don't know, you can't cap that 2%. But there are caveats in there saying, we're going to cap it at 2%. But if you had a town that, let's say, had a referendum for a school project, on the referendum question, people would be saying, yes, I'm going to support this. And yes, I realize that I am also casting my vote to go over the 2% to be able to pay that bonding. Because usually you have a referendum, but you're not really bonding until a year or two later. And so people could easily forget, yes, I voted for that school, but now I don't want to pay for it. So we wanted to make sure that that was included. And there's also a caveat that if for some particular reason, your town felt very strongly about raising more taxes or raising the property tax by higher than 2%, you would have the ability by a 60% vote of the municipality to override that to what you want.
Yeah.
But it really does, I think that's a very good model. We've looked at Massachusetts and some other states that do that, because property tax is the #1 driver of people leaving our state, because it is so regressive on some level. We have older people that bought their house in my area for $20,000, and now their property taxes are $25,000.
Yeah.
Because somebody from New York bought a little Cape Cod and built a McMansion next to them.
it.
So you're taxing people on unrealized gain, and that's something that has to change, and that's actually what puts us in one of the worst taxed state situations.
Yeah.
So,
We actually testified on a similar proposal to the 2% in the Planning and Development Committee on Monday. And I think one of the big concerns, and I know actually Comptroller Scanlon, when he was still at the Finance Committee, had raised this issue. We went back and forth. Is how would towns address unfunded mandates that do come down from the legislature? How would we meet that obligation if we can only raise revenue at a 2% level?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. As a former mayor, I used to have my list of unfunded mandates every year that I would talk to my legislators about. That's part of the plan. We'd have to look at the unfunded mandates that we're putting on municipalities, and we have to strip those back. It doesn't work. You can't have a 2% cap, but then you continue to put mandates. And mandates are everything from you have to teach this class, you have to have this amount of people per student, on the education side. On the other side, it's like you have to print all of your notices in the paper. I hear that every year. Like, can we go to online? Can we just print it and post it in the doorway? So there are many mandates that we're looking at. We've actually, maybe you guys can help. We've reached out to municipalities and said, give us your top 10 that are so costly or so cumbersome. And I don't think people realize, you may have something that costs a lot of money, but it's also the man hours of having to put all this work into getting to where you are. And, that's a cost that's, the average citizen doesn't see. So I think that's really important. They go together. We have to do that.
Yeah, unfunded mandates has been on our
absolutely. I'm going to pitch one of my bills that I think you guys are going to like.
Of course, yeah.
Okay, it's SB 229, and it's in finance. I'm trying to get it raised, and I think you might be interested because I was trying to be creative on how can we allow municipalities to find a revenue source that doesn't necessarily impact their everyday citizens, but that would allow them to, in this particular case, pay for the offsets of what we're seeing in tourism. And tourism is across the board. It's Mystic, but it's also the other end of the state. We have, I represent Mystic, which is the #1 tourist destination, but we're actually at the tipping point where our local municipalities don't want to have any more events because they have to pay for policing, the road, you have more people coming in, how do they manage the sewers? What do we do about, the wear and tear just on the town in general? Who's going to empty the garbage after, it really adds up. So there's a benefit, but all that money is going to the state. It's not going to the local municipality. So I have a bill in that allows municipalities to add an excise tax to venues, hotels, or restaurants. And, it's a very small amount. So if you can imagine if you're going to a restaurant and you're paying a 0.25% tax, not 25, 0.025, so 0.025% on a meal, whatever, the municipality gets to decide what the level is. And it comes back directly to the town, whether it's a venue or a restaurant or a hotel. It gives them an opportunity to raise funds that then can be reinvested into the community, really by people visiting. And I think it was a creative way. I've talked to some local towns that are really interested in seeing this move forward. And it would have to pass by an ordinance of their town. They could vote on whether they agree with it or not. It could be a 0.001% on something, those three things, and they would have to use it for really infrastructure, policing, ways to offset the impacts of visitors coming to their town. I didn't allow it to go be used for the education budget because I didn't want them to say, okay, well, we're going to charge you, 50% when you rent a venue here. So just trying to be creative to allow municipalities to do that. And there was some discussion, if this revenue comes in, should it go to the state and then have the state redistribute it? And I said, absolutely not. I know what that's like. Because many towns send a lot to the state and get very little in the return. So, if you eat in a town, if you're renting a venue in the town could decide then to have an additional, surcharge or small tax that could go back to them.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
The idea of revenue diversification is certainly something that we've have discussed for many years. And I know recently I've been talking with Scott Dolch from the Restaurant Association. And looking at that 1% increase in the meal and beverage tax, which right up until the last budget day, a few years back was to go back. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, especially as we've seen 7+ years of
Right.
Excess, of significant budget surpluses. When can we start to help our towns?
I do have a bill in for that too, of that 1%,
And the
wanting
Mash-
to come back to the municipalities in which it was purchased in.
Or the Mashantucket Pequot Fund, which is historically low,
Yep.
certainly down in your area. We can't do it now with, again, 7 years of state budgets. Why can't we return that money, which was intended for our towns?
Right.
Especially our impacted towns.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think having the perspective of being a mayor before this and being on a council for 10 years has really opened my eyes to, what happens in Hartford and how it is delivered down to the municipalities.
Yeah.
And I think that sometimes here, especially if you haven't had that kind of experience, your perspective is not as open and as wide as it should be. We talk about eliminating the car tax.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds terrific. But when I remember as a mayor, it was, okay, where am I going to raise $8 million?
Where do you make up that money? Yeah.
I'm going to have to go to my property tax people that are already overburdened. So I think it's really important that we keep in perspective that, this money is our townspeople's money. This is our mom and dads, our nurses, our mechanics, our firemen, our doctors, our, teachers that are paying into the state.
Mm-hmm.
And, they've reached sort of a tipping point, and we also have in our municipalities. So we need to be mindful that this is not state money. This is citizens' money, and we need to be able to spend it appropriately, give relief when we can, stop the mandates. When we talk about, especially in the educational system, which is the cost driver for local municipality budgets, I would love to see a study that said, before these mandates, 35 years ago, what was the educational outcome versus now with all these mandates that we have, and we're spending X amount more? Are our kids graduating that are smarter? Are they more prepared? That would be a very interesting, I know the world has changed, but I think it would be measurable. And I bet you would find that with all the additional funding, with all the different mandates, I'm not sure the outcomes have increased where we think they should be. So I think that would be an interesting study and looking at
Really
it again.
performance-based,
Yes,
results.
absolutely. Right. Are we graduating kids that are ready to go into the workforce? Can they read? Can they write? Can they do math? Do they know how to access a computer? Are they financially literate? Whatever the measurements are that a group would develop, just to look if what we've done over the last 30 or 45 years is actually working. And we're spending an inordinate amount of money, and are we really getting the results that we think that we are? Because it's extremely stressful for municipalities, especially older people that are on a fixed income, when they look after that revaluation and their house has gone up because if they sit on their toilet and peek out the window, they can see a little bit of water. That puts a great stress. And I've talked to a lot of young people, whether they're in the northern part of the district, across Connecticut. They have good salaries, they're working, but they still can't make it here because they're like, if I buy a house, I have to look at what the property tax is going to cost me. And so those are all things I think we really need to be more cognizant of. And it's becoming increasingly more difficult to buy a house, to fund a house, and be able to actually set roots down here. So whatever we can do.
Excellent.
You are listening to the Municipal Voice on WNHH 103.5 FM.
And with us now, we have House Ranking Member Joe Paletta and House Chair on Finance, Maria Horn. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Good to have you both here. So we're here today to talk about budget, proposed budget. Brian, what kind of questions do we have?
I was just going to say, what are your thoughts coming ahead? I know the Republicans have put out some different ideas. I know the House Dems and Senate Dems are also doing the same. Can you share anything that you've learned from the governor's budget that's going to be released momentarily?
So I think I applaud the governor for trying to have a budget that's stable and broad based in terms of the people that it helps, as well as investing in particular areas like special education and early childhood. As usual, the legislature will have its own thoughts on how to do that. We did some of the work on early childhood, for example, last year, setting up some of the structures for that kind of investment, and I hope we can use those going forward. But as always in a budget, the big picture is one thing, and it really comes down to the details and what's in those line items.
That's fair. Representative?
Yes, and thank you, for having us on. And I think it's an important discussion. like the chair said, it's great that the governor put out what I would call working plan, because we all know that it's going to change in the end. But particularly from our side of the aisle, we are very focused on those fiscal guardrails that have gotten us to this point of great success over the last several years. And, I'm sure the governor is going to touch on each one of those today, but it's going to be interesting going forward to see where we end up in terms of whether or not they are going to be tweaked. I think the consensus, at least on our side of the aisle, is that we'd like to see these guardrails remain in place because they have set us up for a future recession, for any potential cuts that are coming from the federal government. So, it remains to be seen, but it is a work in progress, and I think, in the end, we can work together to find some common ground on a lot of areas of that budget.
And that kind of leads to one of the questions I was going to ask both of you. Do you think there's any flexibility in the guardrails, specifically with the volatility cap or anything along those lines? I know there's no real desire to get rid of them.
Yeah, so I think it's clear to emphasize that last point, which is that I actually don't really, I can't remember a serious conversation I've had with anyone who wants to get rid of them. They have done, as Representative Paletta has just said, really good things for the state of Connecticut in terms of saving us, first of all, paying out our pensions, creating a rainy day fund out of essentially nothing. And those are, from my end, essentially progressive policies, because they will enable us, at least to limit the amount of pain if we do face a recession or significant federal cuts. That said, I also think that guardrails, I very much am committed to having them survive for the long run. And in order to make that happen, I think there needs to be a little flexibility. And I think you will see that flexibility from the governor today, which I'm pleased to see. I want to maintain adherence to the principles and the structure of the guardrails. But I think we've learned a lot, and I think we need to pay attention to
adapt
data.
to the realities as they change.
Right.
Yeah.
And, to that point, I'm anxious to hear what the governor is going to say today in terms of adjusting the guardrails. As of right now, I would like to see them remain in place, but I'm going to listen carefully, as my colleagues are, and I'm sure, in the end, we will be able to opine more on it. Right now, of what I've heard, it mainly has to do with the volatility cap. And where that money will go, I can't really speak to that right now. But I think in the end, we should definitely be careful of undoing anything that we've set in motion over the last 8 years, because we still have not seen these caps work under a recession. And I think that's what really, again, in terms of my personal opinion, my side of the aisle, we are concerned. I applaud Representative Horn here, the chair, for setting up a informational hearing on these guardrails, which I think is going to be very educational for all of our members on the committee and the General Assembly as a whole, to understand how these caps work, one, and two, how they would work if and when we were to experience a recession. Yeah,
and I would just love to pick up on what Paletta, we are going to have an informational forum in finance on the guardrails, and to his point, first of all, to give a clear picture of how they work. They're very complicated, and people focus on one piece or another, but they work together as an integrated whole. And first of all, what they are, what they've done for us in terms of protecting us from a recession, or what a recession might look like in terms of that protection, but also honestly what they've kept us from doing and what the kind of spending they've foreclosed. So we can take an honest. We're trying to keep it focused on not advocacy at that forum, but just facts.
Very good. And actually, one of the themes that has come across with some of our previous guests is affordability in Connecticut. What do you see the committee doing? Is it tax cuts? Looking at energy costs. What do you see passing through your committee?
Well, I can tell you, I am focused on right now. I have said from the beginning, when I became chair of the Finance Committee, the one things I was committed to was trying to make our tax code simpler, more accessible to people, and then I have participated right along with my colleagues in making it more complicated every year, because we try to serve, individual constituencies, and so I'm looking at that list of proposals we have this year and some of the things that are most important to me, and I'm trying to find a way to bring them together to bring meaningful relief to people. It's one thing to say that you have had some theoretical broad-based relief, but it doesn't really have any effect on people. I'd like to do something meaningful, even though, understanding that it's not, we don't have, a lot of excess flowing around, but I'd like to have it be meaningful to people.
Representative?
And look, a budget's about priorities. And while, we don't have a Ways and Means Committee, we do have a Finance Committee that deals with the tax structure. How about our property taxes? I mean, they are the most egregious tax in the state of Connecticut. They don't go based on income. We have folks that are struggling to get by with inflation and with the high cost of living here in the state. I'd like to see our committee tackle that. There has been some proposals floating around on write-offs or whatnot, but the property tax is definitely a problem. And going back to our fiscal guardrails, we may have some extra money. I don't know. We're going to hear about that. But what I'm going to be interested in listening to is, whether or not any of that extra money can go back to some of the towns and cities and help them in the way of tax relief with property taxes. We have a special education system in Connecticut that needs to be reformed, that needs to be looked at. Just in my town alone, and in Waterbury and in Watertown, we are experiencing 85% of our budget increases going to special ed.
Yeah.
So we talk a lot up here about doing things to help people locally, but we have to put our money where our mouth is and look at each individual town, what their needs are. And I bet, and you all representing these towns and cities across Connecticut are going to say, SPED is number one, mandates from the state are number two, property taxes is a big problem. Those are things that I think we should be focusing on here.
Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there's another kind of group of issues that we were kind of interested in for this year, and they all sort of relate to flooding in Connecticut. We're talking about, resiliency planning, increasing funding for infrastructure projects. What are your thoughts on some of this? When we look back at the flooding in Seymour last year, the flooding in Eastern Connecticut the year before, where do you come in on that?
So I represent 9 small towns, and actually when we had our significant flooding, it was really largely based in Massachusetts and New York, which means we didn't even qualify for a lot of the FEMA stuff because it wasn't centered in Connecticut. So I am seeing farms getting wiped out. I'm seeing towns have to pay for infrastructure that they've lost.
Yeah.
It is a significant problem, and I look forward to both continuing to invest in that through through DEEP, but also making sure. I have seen some of those grants, particularly within DEEP, but not just within DEEP, that they're bond funding. They exist in theory, but getting that money out the door to the people who really need it in a timely way has not always worked so well, and including to our towns. And I really don't want to tie that up further. I would like to make that process quicker and more efficient.
Well, I represent Watertown, which was hit partially by the flood in the summer, but Oxford, Southbury, Monroe got just decimated. I was pleased to see yesterday in the governor's brief that he had some money for flood mitigation. And I'm going to say that is kudos to the governor. It's something that I'd like to see in this biennium budget. I'm sure my
Amen.
chair agrees. And because our area was really, really hurt badly by this, and I think it's going to be a plus for people that can tap into this fund and help. I mean, we have businesses in Oxford, Connecticut. You talk to the first selectman, George Temple, that still are shuttered. They're boarded up. So, if again, a budget is about priorities. I'd like to see that money in the budget.
Yeah. Brian, I know we were studying flooding in Connecticut, and we released a report on it. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's one of our legislative items this year, and so we'll be working together with you on that. I think one of the things we're looking at is resiliency, but also just funding and building capacity within our towns to actually make some of these changes. And I think to Representative Paletta's point, there's only so much you can do with the property tax to pay for it. So we are going to look for state assistance, particularly on some of these larger projects.
I'd like to revive a concept that I've discussed with my towns and possibly with you, I can't remember, but basically to particularly help small towns with some of those investments, because often if it's federal funds or even state funds, smaller towns have a harder time raising the matching money.
Yeah.
And so to have some fund available, even if it's within DOT, that could really be there to help those small towns that don't have the ability to raise the extra money, to get those projects moving, because it's costly for them.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Brian O'Connor. I'm the Director of Public Policy for CCM. I'm joined by Randy Collins, who is the Associate Director of Public Policy at CCM, and he's also our lead analyst for both Finance and the Appropriations Committee. And as we like to say today on Budget Day, all things budget. This is something that we plan on doing throughout the session, is trying to give updates not only on budgetary issues but also just general issues that the legislature is bringing up, and we're looking for feedback from you all, and also just to educate and provide as much information as we can to you so you get it in real time. Without further ado, I'm going to have Randy go over some of the key figures that came out in the budget today, and also some of the policy changes that have been proposed anyway by the governor. This budget was just released at noon, and this is our initial overview of it. We'll have more detailed response coming up in the next day or two. So, Randy?
Thank you, Brian. I think our first look at this budget is, in terms looking at it from a municipal perspective, there's really not a lot there. The biggest increase that we saw in municipal aid, or that was claimed as an increase in municipal aid, was about an additional 157 in the first year for education. But that's been a plan in place for almost 10 years now, to bring towns up to the ECS statutory formula. So that money has already been kind of baked into the budget for the last few years. It went to 157 million in additional ECS funding this year, and I think it will go to 168 million the following year. But when we look at some of the major line items for municipalities that we really look for right off the bat, we look at pilot funding, motor vehicle reimbursements. In terms of pilot, there's a $12.5 million increase, generally based on, and these are statutorily, these adjustments are statutorily made through the formula, so it's not a policy change. So we're seeing a slight increase in pilot, but we are going to see almost a $27 million decrease in motor vehicle reimbursements, as a lot of municipalities are undergoing reval. Commercial property values are falling, and that is impacting some of these reimbursement rates. So I'd say overall, we looked at Town Aid Road remaining flat funded, LoCIP, and some of those STEEP, I believe, are also going to be remain flat funded. So while some towns will see some slight increases, I think, and some towns are going to see some decreases in proposed funding from the governor's budget. It's really going to be something that we have to look at. A couple other things that we're a little bit concerned about. When they recreated the tiered pilot, based on piloted payment in lieu of taxes for reimbursement, one of the major caveats that we fought to have included was that no town would receive less than what they had received in fiscal year 21. The governor proposes to remove that floor. So where now we only worry about fight to go up, now we'll also have to look at making sure that we don't go down in that pilot reimbursement. And they're also looking to rework the municipal spending cap that's been in place but has never really been enforced. That if you increase municipal taxes by, I forgot,
I think it's like 2.5%.
2.5%, that you could see up to a 10% reduction in your supplemental revenue sharing grant. So as towns are facing inflationary pressure without really a means to save, without revenue diversification, they're really only allowed to go to that property tax to meet those financial obligations. And if you have to increase taxes to do that, you will be then punished. So I think we have a long way to go with this budget.
Yeah, and I was going to say there's another provision that we're going to get confirmation on it. But whenever there's excess money that is raised for the municipal revenue sharing grant, it's usually certified by Comptroller Scanlon at the end of September, and the money's distributed to towns. We don't get it every year, but they're proposing that this money, or these monies, go back to the general fund and not to municipalities. So we're very concerned about that provision as well.
Yeah, as I said, given I just think the fact that, as a lot of people are saying is, 7 years in a row of, state budget surplus. And then to see municipal aid, as I said, relatively outside of some minor increases in education funding. There was a proposal for an additional $40 million in special education, but that wouldn't be until the second year of the biennium, which is clearly short of, I think, the $90 million shortfall that we had projected. So we're falling behind. I don't believe that this budget will even allow towns to stay flat. They're going to have to raise property taxes to meet, rising costs of health insurance, inflationary costs, utility energy costs that continue to rise, all the pressures that our taxpayers are facing, our municipalities are facing those same costs, and this budget does not provide relief for them, as I said, either in the terms of additional state aid or meaningful ability to save and spend less.
Yeah, and I, we've been talking a lot about some of the concerns that we have with the budget. I mean, there were a couple things that we do are very supportive of. Looking at the provisions for apprenticeship programs and summer youth employment. That's part of our Young People First report and our 119 Commission recommendations. So there was a positive there, and I think the other one, and maybe you can speak to this because of your work on it, is flood mitigation. So I think that's an area that we're in alignment with the governor. There is one area, it's more on the bonding side, but there's an additional $500 million in school construction. That'll be helpful. And, there's also an additional $400 million in housing. That is very important to our membership as well. And one other area that we did see some investment, we'll have to look at what the exact numbers are, but expanding rail, busing and systems, mass transit systems within Connecticut, looking at the eastern side of the Connecticut, but also looking at the Waterbury line in the Northwest Hills. So I think it's very important that those investments happen. But at the same time, just maintaining the status quo, municipalities are falling behind. And so we're going to be advocating for additional funding to help support some of our largest cost drivers at the municipal level, special education and general education.
Mm-hmm. Because if we don't work, we hear a lot about affordable housing, and one of the main reasons housing is so unaffordable is because of the property tax. And
right.
Until we reduce that over-reliance on that property tax, it'll be hard to develop that needed housing, and it's going to stifle our economic growth.
Well, very good. Well, we thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to keep doing these on a more regular basis, just to keep you informed as the budget process goes through the legislature and other issues of importance to our cities and towns. So again, thank you, Randy, and thank you for joining us.
I'd like to thank all of our guests for helping us kick off the session and dive into these issues. Thanks to the folks at the Capitol who let us hold the podcast here. The Municipal Voice is a co-production by CCM, WNHH 103.5 FM. Thanks to Harry Draws back at WNHH, and thanks to the policy team for partnering with us on this one.